Hello, everybody. This is Assembly Member Ron Kim from Queens. I am here today joined by Gail Radford to have an amazing conversation about state building and the history of state building in the 20th century and her research and book, the Rise of Public Authorities. Um, this is a topic that I feel very passionate about, and it's only been in recent times that I realized that there's so many layers of these so-called authorities that have been created over the years. Some of us know these entities as commissions, public benefit corporations, authorities. But the point is, there are hundreds, if not, up to even thousands of these local state authorities around the country. And most of us, when we hear them, we think about, quasi government agencies, maybe a little shadowy. We don't know what they do, but we think of transportation. Sometimes we think of housing, but we're not quite sure what they do and how they were created and who they serve. So I think it's important for us to understand the very basic structure of it first. But before we start, I'm going to hand over to Gail to introduce herself and how she ended up researching public authorities and how she landed in this space. I just want to open up by saying that as a lawmaker who's been in office for now 10 years, it's been super frustrating, especially when we have natural catastrophes, emergencies, crises like the COVID, where I feel like lawmakers and politicians have been reduced to being glorified resource brokers, unable to actually deliver solutions and fix anything, and at best, professional ribbon cutters who show up to communities to cut checks where we're punting our responsibilities to third parties and contract agencies. And to read about the history of what Gail had written and how there was a period when presidents, governors, and politicians and administrators would come together and build public good to tell the private sector that, hey, you're not doing a good job here in serving these vulnerable constituents, so we have to take a stand and do something. It's inspiring because it's not that long ago that we did this, and there's a blueprint on how to do it. And it's about time that we relearn these things so we can build public good, public value, public capital, and public institutions. So with that, let me bring in Gail to introduce herself. Gail, how did you get to this point of spending so much time researching public authorities?
It's a good question. I became interested in public authorities when I was working on my first book project on the history, the origins of federal housing policy during the 1930s. This was the period of the Great Depression and the New Deal. And the housing sector had been really the first big part of the economy to go down in the 1920s. And the main thrust of the federal policies that were developed in the 1930s were aimed at rebuilding, restructuring the market for freestanding suburban type houses supplied by for-profit developers. But Congress realized that even if their plans were successful and the private market was revivified, there were a lot of people who weren't going to be able to participate. They were simply too poor with very low incomes. So there was a modest program that was set up to supply apartment-style housing to low-income families. And there was federal money that was set aside to go to local governments that wanted to to build this kind of housing for their population. The money, though, that Congress sent when the program was established didn't go straight to the local governments. It was sent to these things called housing authorities, and especially as and these things that these kinds of apartment dwellings that were aimed at low-income people, they are what we tend to call these days public housing. Okay, so at the time that I was reading about them, public housing had acquired a pretty negative reputation. This was the late 1980s. And so I was doubly curious as to what housing authorities were, and for that matter, what were authorities in general, and why had Congress chosen these structures to manage its housing program on a local level. So I looked around for books and articles to answer my question. And this is the backstory of a lot of books that get written. I couldn't find what I was looking for. And eventually, after I finished my first book, I thought, I'm going to write the book that I have wanted to find. And when I did, I discovered that housing authorities were, and authorities in general were mechanisms that were invented in the early 20th century during a period of explosive growth in cities and metropolitan areas in general. And residents of these very dense environments, they started putting pressure on their public officials to provide goods and services that they couldn't do for themselves, like they might have in the days when people were living in a rural environment on their family farm. And private investors weren't coming forward to supply these kinds of needs. And what I'm talking about is things like clean water, electricity, parks, reliable public transportation. So public officials wanted to respond. They wanted to be able to use government to help people, very much like you were talking about in the introduction. But at the time, they were hemmed in by a lot of legal rules that kept local government from being able to do very much at all. And the biggest barrier that local governments faced when they wanted to do something actively was the fact that there were all these laws against borrowing very much. So they weren't able to float bonds, to get capital, to build large infrastructure facilities that would be able to produce and distribute these kinds of goods that people were clamoring for. So they came up, the public officials came up with an innovation called authorities. And these were essentially government-owned companies. And they incorporated them so that they incorporated these authorities, they set up what became these corporations. And because they had a separate legal identity, formally, they weren't subject to the same kinds of rules that the local governments had faced. So this meant that they could raise the kind of money that they wanted or they felt they needed, and could do some of these activist things that both the city residents and the politicians had wanted. So how to evaluate this line of institutional development as we look back from today? I think that we have to applaud the kind of commitment that people had to expanding the ability of government to help citizens. And we have to recognize that we have enormous amounts of public infrastructure that might have been impossible to provide if we hadn't invented, if our if these people who lived earlier than we do hadn't invented these structures. But at the same time, they have some real downsides, and it's my opinion that we could reform them. We could work on developing them in a better direction. And I think that's what the subject that we're going to be delving into tonight. So I'll stop right now. And
Yeah. Well, thank you for that background on how you got into studying and researching public authorities. Just to briefly recap, there was a period when our nation was growing and the people everyday needs were growing with it, but due to the lack of legal structures in place and the lack of revenues, they couldn't finance many public projects, and as a result, it seems like we had to create these mechanisms to finance and pay for the roads and the bridges that we enjoy today. And that was like the beginning of the authority that were designed. But and you also mentioned in your writing that perhaps the original framers, the designers, the state builders, when they were creating this, they were authentic in their intention to serve the needs of the people that these authorities were being created for. So I'm wondering, in your research, Gail, like, has there been an example of a public authority, a commission, or a public benefit corporation? I'm going to call it an authority to cover all those things from now on. At any level of government that is governed by the people it serves, is there an example of a democratized public authority that you think, hey, these people got it right?
well, the short answer is no. But the longer answer is, democratization. There's a lot of ways that we could define making something more democratic, and the first thing has with in the present day, it seems to me, is that we have to make them more transparent, because there's no way, the first step is that we have to know what they're doing, and the rules that govern them now, which did not come down from God and can presumably be changed, don't mandate that they tell us much about what they're doing. Now, there, right at the beginning, when people were starting to think about organizing these kinds of things, you mentioned how at the federal level, even activist presidents like Woodrow Wilson and FDR, they were drawn to these kinds of structures because it gave them the ability to initiate activity in the market that they didn't have otherwise. And one really interesting example of this was the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, and his Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, came up with during the First World War. There was a problem we faced recently with supply chains because the United States didn't have that many cargo ships, and we had a big trade with Europe. And when the war started, at the beginning, we had relied on mostly the British, but some German and Austrian ships. And all of these became unavailable. And we didn't join the war initially. And the administration felt, saw that we had to continue to have foreign trade or our economy was going to be in terrible shape. So Wilson and McAdoo came up with this plan to basically have a government-owned shipping corporation, and they thought that that would deal with the immediate emergency, but also it was they thought of it as a mechanism that they could use after the war to guide foreign trade, and not be so beholden on just where Great Britain wanted to take ships and sort of step out on our own and be in charge of our economy more. So they came up with this idea of a government-owned corporation that would be a shipping corporation. And the directors, this is the interesting part, the directors, according to their original plan, were going to be the president, the secretary of the Treasury, secretary of Commerce, maybe a couple of other people from the cabinet. But the directors were going to be elected officials, and people would know who was making the decisions about foreign trade, and if they disliked, it would be quite transparent what was going on, and if they didn't like it, it could be one of the things that, or they liked it or they didn't like it, could be one of the things by which they could decide how to vote for the federal executive. And this partially because Congress, not because of, there were issues about, well, maybe this is government ownership might be a bad idea. We can't, there was some rumblings about that. But the real problem with getting this enacted according to the original vision was that Congress didn't want to give up all that much power to the executive over the economy. And but the need during the war was so strong, and then that eventually Congress passed it. It's supposed to be on an emergency, a temporary basis. That's why they called it the Emergency Fleet Corporation. But it turned out to be so helpful that the Emergency Fleet Corporation lasted almost until the Second World War, when Roosevelt rolled it into the Commerce Department. But so what I think is really interesting about this particular episode is that it makes the directors much more obvious to the public. And I think that, as a first step toward the public being able to, for these things to be accountable democratically, is we've got to know that the people who run them have to be better known. And I'm not sure that this is a particular way, but the outcome, I think, um, is what's interesting here. So, but you had, I mean, your idea, your question about whether they can be democratically accountable, I think, is connected to ideas that people in the legislature have been debating with as they've passed these very interesting public authority reform acts starting in '05, and then there was another one in '09, and I'm interested in your response to how you think that these reforms, if they seem to have made any difference to a person who's in the legislature looking at it from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the structural attempts have been at all effective in reshaping who's serving on these boards and how much transparency there is on how people are appointed to some of these commissions and authorities. But I do think perhaps the most significant reform, at least in New York, was what kind of projects could be financed through these authorities. And I think there was a reform act that was passed in 2000 that limited the scope to capital expenditures and capital projects. So, and we don't have a clear definition, a statutory definition of what constitutes a capital expenditure. We kind of, we just kind of go with the accounting definition, general accounting definition, what a capital is. So all that kind of was meant to narrow down at that time, just counter the criticism that there's too much debt and there's too much borrowing, and we should be having a more balanced budget, and I think that was the knee-jerk reaction to at least give the public the impression that these authorities are not out of control. So which leads me to the next question. The comptroller's office had written a report that shows almost 90% of the state public debts are financed through these authorities in New York, while our general government agencies have not increased in size in terms of new hires or administrators. We've actually been downsized as a state government in terms of state workers. So consequently, it seems like we are borrowing to ultimately outsource administrative duties, and not like the Wilson and the emergency fleet corporations, where it was very hands-on, and and the private markets were very upset, in fear that they were going to take over commerce. But that's not what we're doing. We borrow to actually subsidize third parties and corporations and nonprofits. So my question is there a healthy balance between general government functioning agencies and public authorities?
Well, I think that the balance could be healthy if public authorities were reined in and had to operate more under the kinds of rules that general purpose government is subject to. And I mean, just going back to the the question that you had about them being more democratically accountable. I mean, these reform acts that were passed established something called the Authority Budget Office, which has been collecting and publicizing information about um, the projects that these public authorities take on and what their borrowing is and other things about their decision making. But we haven't. But this office just needs enormous. It needs to be bulked up. We need more people doing this. Because it's just as you said, I mean, these things are issuing enormous amounts of debt. They're very active, and nobody's watching the store. So the first thing is we have to know what's going on, and I mean, there may be. I personally don't understand in a state as rich as we are that has money to give billionaires for setting up recreational, baseball stadium, football stadiums. Why we can't hire? There is money in the Treasury. It may not be as much as we like, but we do have money, and we make decisions about how to use it. And one decision has to be to spend more money on personnel that can provide better oversight. So first step, the public has to know what's going on. And I think a lot of people have articulated this in the legislature. This is not like some kind of breakthrough. It's not real complicated. It's not like brain surgery, but for some reason, there isn't the political will yet to do this. But I think that it took a long time to develop these agencies, and it wasn't a linear process. It wasn't. There was a certain amount of trial and error, human creativity, and patience was involved. So I don't see why the same kind of effort can't go in to modifying the way these things work now. I mean, I don't think we can just get rid of them all, not tomorrow at least. We're too dependent on them. So I think we have to turn them into something better.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've alluded to this a little bit, and some of our, in my opinion, New York's, if not the nation's, greatest examples of these authorities came like the Port Authority and the Power Authorities that were created when FDR was the governor. It seems like it was created and it was entering in an era where we had more progressive tax codes in our nation, in our state, that built better safety nets and social good for working people. I think we also had a better administrative state that believed in direct public service and not outsourced contracts which we've kind of normalized over the last 40 years. So, is there like a sweet spot in terms of a functioning administrative state and progressive revenue stream to bring out the best of public authorities? And secondly, like, can public authorities replace administrative states and progressive taxes? Can they? Because it seems like if you don't put a check on it, that's where we're heading right now.
Well, I guess they could. I don't think that they would create uh, the best society, the one that a lot of us aspire to. Um, they would move everything toward fee for service commodification of everything, and for a lot of us, that's what we're trying to work against. So I guess it could happen, but I don't see why it has to. And you talked about how one of the differences um, in in a better period that you were sketching out and today was how there were progressive taxes. And I want to push back against that a little bit to say that actually uh, uh, FDR um, was quite a fiscal conservative, and he um, he spent money. He was willing for the federal government to go into debt because he wanted to respond to human suffering, but in his heart he wasn't a Keynesian, and and uh, really he really was very pleased to find ways around direct spending. And so I think, and 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 other people who have relied on public authorities have found them useful for this reason. They don't confront the public with the fact that to have nice things, we have to pay for them through taxes. And um, one thing that I can say, and so I think that some of us who want a more progressive, caring government have to confront this head on and have to be honest to the public that nice things cost money. Now, this is probably the only good thing that I'll ever say about the kind of radical um, uh, inequality that we have in our society these days. But the the old joke about why did the robber go to the bank? That's where the money is. Well, right now, I think that the very small amount of people own so much money uh, that we can do a lot by you know taxing the rich, and it doesn't. So we can. So in a way, we're not going to totally have to frighten all all of the voters and say, "Oh, you're going to have to pay massive more taxes." Well, maybe some more taxes, but the people that really need to pay taxes, because we need income and we need to not just get it in these indirect ways through public authorities that people don't even know about, floating bonds and bringing in revenue. We need to do it more upfront, more honestly, and I think we need to convince people that we have to that government needs to be um, better supported economically.
Gail, 100% agree with you when it comes to um, taxing the rich. And, we've been part of an Invest New York campaign for the last 2 years. I've sponsored a capital gains tax bill that would potentially bring back $6 to $8 billion of preferential capital gains that the federal government gives out to the super rich that they don't even know that they're collecting because they're not even looking at it. They're wondering, why am I getting a better preferential rate than people income? Um, and also we have wealth tax, inheritance tax. There's a number of, I think, proposals that we haven't, executed yet, but we look forward to achieving those uh, in the coming sessions. But you know, like you said, structurally, institutionally, we've come to rely on these authorities um, to build public infrastructure, and also now, encroaching on even public education. Like we've issued, I think, a smart technology bond through the school construction authority um, 2 years ago to build the public infrastructure for schools by borrowing against future revenues for these public schools. It's not just hard infrastructure. Now we're looking at soft infrastructure because there are many things that property taxes are simply not going to finance unless and because legislature don't have the courage yet to say, hey, this is the wealthiest state and we have the biggest wealth gap and we have the most concentrated power and money and wealth at a rate that we've never seen in this country, and we don't have the courage to deconcentrate that wealth and invest back in our communities. We are borrowing, like you said, by floating these bonds um, in through these authority types. Um, and I just and I think there could be a better balance here. There could be, I think, a reformed, better authority that is democratized, that truly is run and dictated by the people it serves, not political appointees that are just collecting side check, income, whatever it is, that they're doing on these boards. I think there's a number of things that we can do um, to improve this process, and I certainly hope that we can get there. A couple of questions from our students in my class at the new school. First one is from Jake. Um, he's asking, let's see, how, in your view, should municipal power be concentrated to enable greater public control and investment in capital infrastructure? What framework would help reverse the fragmentation of governance you speak to in your book and allow elected officials to effectively build public capital?
These, I'm not getting the question written out, so I'm just
Oh, sure.
remembering what it is that you've said, and it seems to me that there's really two questions here, and the first one has to do with public power, and specifically, but then more generally, the second part of the question. But I I I'm not I'm not really an expert on the power sector. I do know that there are um, environmental groups in the state who are they're frustrated that the New York Power Authority doesn't seem to be moving very quickly on green technology and and uh, and 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 they're not really clear why. And again, this speaks to how opaque these agencies are. Um, it's one thing to try and affect them, but we don't even really know what kinds of how they're making decisions and why. Um, and so that goes back to my thought that we just need to require a lot more reporting and transparency from these things, and also, but then there was a second part of the question. Can you read that, Ron?
Of course. Hold on one second. The second question is what framework would help reverse the fragmentation of governance that you
Um,
speak to in your book and allow elected officials to effectively build public capital?
yeah, the fragmentation. Um, I mean, here in Western New York, I mean, we have so many of these things. My favorite of the horribles is these industrial development agencies that basically subsidize businesses to move from one part of Western New York to another and use public resources to do that. And what this speaks to is that these things are so each one is its own little empire in the Empire State, and with its own vision for whatever it is they're supposedly created for. Um, and there's no sort of it undermines the possibility for there to be a larger strategy for delivering goods and services, but also for economic development. So I don't know. I mean, at the a lot of these local development um, agencies, I think, just need to be um, just need to be gotten rid of. I mean, there's one thing about we can't just turn off the power authority, but I'm I'm uh, I'm I think that the kinds of even self-dealing and corruption that separate from um, mismanagement or just being dumb that these things represent. Um, I think that we could get public opinion on our side to get rid of some of these things because they just cost us money. They just give away our tax money, and the rest of us pay more in taxes to make it up. So, okay. So that's the best I can do on that.
Yeah, no, I think what's frustrating to me as we kind of wrap up our session here is that the original designers, the intention behind serving the public is over the years, over the many decades, and over under the ages of different type of executives have been lost, and it's because of the lack of transparency and the accountability. It's just becoming this intermediary conduit to give away taxpayers' money without any kind of oversight because we can't do it through government agencies. It's unconstitutional. So we activate these intermediaries to do that for us. And when we have bad executives like the past governor of New York that knows the system inside out, he takes away the controller's power to audit these agencies, the contracts, and then he appoints all his people that follows his orders to serve his circle of contractees under the guise of economic development, which we know is costing us, under his watch, cost us up to 1.2, $1.3 million per one job in places like Buffalo at some
Yes,
point. Um,
yes.
so it's a complete waste of money. It's like you said, it's fraud, it's corrupt, it's favoritism, and the closer we get to exposing it, what the previous administration has done was create even further shadowy agencies in the form of just nonprofits, not even public benefit authorities. Now, like for example, Department of Health in the state of New York, they have a sister agency called Health Research Institute, HRI, that is not a public benefit authority or corporation, just a 501c3 that handles all the contracting work for DOH, that has absolutely no oversight, and they don't have to come to the hearings, they don't have to comply with our FOIL laws, because it is a completely outside of the scope of authorities and government agencies. So my point is, I think depends on the type of leadership that we have. We can activate these tools to actually create public good, public value, or extract money out of the public for their own individual benefit. And I, for one, I feel optimistic that we have new leaders, new leadership, new members getting elected, who, if we can truly understand the powers of these authorities and the power of new revenue streams, we can find that sweet spot to build public good, public value, public capital once again. And I hope that we can get there together. With that, do you have any final words for our audience? Something for us to look forward to. Some optimism for the future.
Well, this is kind of general, but I mean, it took a long time for these things to develop the way they did, and um, and I think that we have to just settle in for the long haul. I mean, uh, it didn't have to happen this way. It was public choices, and people made these rules and developed these structures, and people can change them with with good values, good leadership. I too feel very optimistic about the people coming into the New York State legislature, as well as some that are already there, no names mentioned. Um, but you know, I just I don't feel fatalistic about it. I think that, and especially the issues that are coming to light in this time of extreme inequality. Um, I think people are looking for ways of doing things in different ways.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today. And if you have not picked up Gail's book, again, it's The Rise of the Public Authority, State Building and Economic Development in 20th Century America. Please go pick that up. It's an amazing read. Thank you so much for your time today, Gail.
Thank you for inviting me. I
Take care.
appreciate it.